This is Jean Booth, GPA at DCFS, and you guys are attending the subrecipient monitoring training. I also have with me Julie Lindsmith and Adriana Kovacevic, who may assist during this presentation. Thank you. We have a lot to go over today, and your time is important to us, just as it is important that we offer instruction and communication between our agency and yours. Today, we're going to go over the monitoring documents and the virtual monitoring process in detail. We'll be using polling to keep the training as interactive as possible. These polls can be reached at the link below. I'm also entering that poll information into the chat box. If you can open a new internet tab on your computer or on your cell phone to access the poll and keep it open during the training, that would be helpful. All poll answers on the poll are anonymous and confidential. So we have no idea who's answering or we know what you're answering, but we have no idea who is answering. So if you feel more comfortable answering through the poll, that's fine. If you're fine answering through the chat box, you can do that as well, but we will know who's answering then. Okay, so our first poll question is, what do you think of when you hear the word monitoring? 1 or 2 word answers that would be great. I'll give you guys a few minutes to answer that. There's a lot of really good answers in here. We've got help, oversight, improve, validation, watching, compliance, checking, TA, audit, VOCA, review and assistance, watching, review. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for answering. I'll give you another couple seconds to finish typing if you need to. Verification, great, thank you. Okay. And our next question is, has your agency ever had a subrecipient monitoring from us? A is yes, B is no, and C is I don't know. A, excellent. So, oop. Hold on, Julie, I just muted you. My bad, hold on.
Hey, Jean,
Okay.
I was trying to say on the last slide, I wanted to talk about the fact that the #1 answer looked like it was audit and how our monitorings are not audits, and we'll discuss that more on one of the future slides. But I just wanted to point that out, that a lot of people think monitorings are audits, and they're different. So, sorry, I just couldn't say it.
No, that's a great thing to mention. I did notice that, and I was going to mention it a little bit later, but that is good to mention during this question and answer session. So yeah, the monitorings are not an audit, and we will go over what that looks like in a little bit. But it looks like most of you have received a monitoring from us before, and some of you are not sure if you have, and that's totally fine. We're putting this on for both of our new people who haven't received a monitoring from us and some of our older people who have received a monitoring from us and just kind of want to get a little bit more information. Our goal this year is to definitely add more information and trainings for all of our subrecipients so that we're a lot more transparent than we have been in the past. So thank you so much for joining us, even though you've had monitorings before. Our next question is your agency scheduled for a subrecipient monitoring from the DCFS Victim Services Grant Management Unit this fiscal year? That is a very large question. Yes. Okay. Looks like a lot of people are yes. Okay. Great. It looks like most of you are scheduled to receive a monitoring from us this year. There's a couple of you who don't have one, or you're not sure if you have one. If you're not sure if you have a monitoring scheduled, you can always go ahead and email us or call us to just verify if you have one scheduled. And we're happy to provide that information for you. And thank you to those of you who don't have one scheduled and just want to get the information so that you're prepared for when you do have one scheduled. That's fantastic. All right, we're going to talk about the purpose of monitoring. The definition on this slide is how the Office of Victims of Crime, or OVC, defines monitoring. Since OVC administers our VOCA funding, and VOCA funding is the largest funding source that the Victim Services Unit at DCFS oversees, it's important for us to make sure we're meeting all the federal requirements when monitoring your agencies, also referred to as subrecipients. OVC's definition is, the overall purpose of monitoring is to ensure the provision of effective victim assistance services through successful subrecipient performance. Monitoring provides reasonable assurance that the subrecipient has administered the funding in compliance with the laws, regulations, and provisions of the award, and that the required performance goals are being achieved. A key thing that we want to highlight in this definition is the word successful. Our goal at DCFS is to help make sure that your agency is as successful as possible at providing the grant-funded services. The goal of monitoring is to provide feedback to subrecipients prior to any item becoming a huge issue. Why do we monitor? Monitorings are completed every 2 years on all funded agencies. We monitor to observe and check the progress, quality, and integrity of the grants that we fund. Open communication, training, technical assistance, coaching, and monitoring are offered and performed with our subrecipients as a way to ensure that we know what's going on with your programs and that we are able to provide guidance, direction, and feedback before a minor issue becomes a bigger problem. Monitoring is not an audit. So it's very important to understand that monitoring is not an audit. We are not auditors. It is a federal requirement that we understand what is going on in your agency, specifically the programs that we fund. We are ultimately responsible for ensuring that the funding is being spent in a way that follows federal rules and guidance. In order to do that, we monitor the programmatic and fiscal portions of every agency that we fund. While it may be similar to an audit, it is very important to understand that this is not an audit. An audit is a formal, systematic, and disciplined approach designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of processes and related controls. Auditing is governed by professional standards, completed by individuals independent of the process being audited, and normally performed by individuals with one of several acknowledged certifications. Objectivity in governance reporting is the benefit of independence. Monitoring is an ongoing process usually directed by management, in this case, your state administrating office, DCFS, to ensure that processes are working as intended. Monitoring is an effective detective control within a process. So you guys have completed you all completed the self-assessment during the application process, and then we did the risk assessments post-award. Then they were done and all levels were given to each subrecipient at the time your NOSA was issued. If your agency is due to receive an on-site review, you've already received an email from either myself or Julie. Due to the pandemic, all of our on-site reviews this year will be virtual. It is required of us to maintain the documentation we requested for your monitoring and follow up with any deficiencies and findings to better help your agency improve with documentation and services that are required from the federal level. And if you have questions on this, the 2 CFR 200-331 is a great way to look and research for that. If your agency is scheduled to have a monitoring this fiscal year, you would have already received these 2 emails. Examples of what they would look like are on this slide. The calendar invite specifies the date and time and a meeting link, and the other 2 attachments, the Federal Civil Rights Compliance Checklist and the Document Request Checklist, along with a list of grants we will be reviewing and information on when the documents are due to us all. So just make sure that you double check when that due date is and get us your documents by that date, or at least email us if you're having issue sending that information at that particular time. Every agency should have received the 7-page Federal Civil Rights Compliance Checklist, both with your NOSA and if you received a monitoring email. I also sent that out earlier this week to all agencies that I was missing, and I think my email sent it out to most of the agencies. This is a required form that must be completed by every agency. This form is due to our agency yesterday, along with the mandatory civil rights training. If you're unfamiliar with this, or you're not sure how to fill it out, or you're having issues with this, please contact our office and we're happy to help you with these forms. The second attachment in your email is the document request checklist. This will have 2 sections that we'll go over in detail, programmatic and fiscal. On the top of the document request checklist, you'll see your agency's name, address, the period we are reviewing, your assigned analyst, and the awards that we are reviewing. The review period and awards are helpful for the amount of requested information in the performance and fiscal documentation. Poll question: the period of performance on my checklist states July 1st, 2021 to August 30th, 2021. I should turn in documents for the following time period: A, September to October 2021, B, June or July 2021, C, sometime within 2021, or D, July and August 2021, or E, none of the above.
We thought we'd give you guys an easy question to start out with in the morning.
Awesome. It looks like most everybody replied with July and August 2021. Oh, we still have a couple answers coming in. We'll give everybody another couple seconds to answer. Okay, it looks like everybody in the chat answered D, July, August 21, and there were a couple September, October 21, and most everybody else replied July and August 2021. So those of you who replied July and August of 2021, you would be correct. Our period of performance that we're reviewing is July and August 2021, so all of your documentation should be within those 2 months. All monitoring documentation should be sent the day the monitoring is scheduled. True or false? All right, it looks like you guys are all on it right now. So yes, the answer to that is false. The email regarding your monitoring will have a date that you need to submit your documentation by. This gives our staff time to review the documentation prior to your monitoring meeting and will reduce the need for multiple meetings. And it will also reduce the need for findings. So this next slide, this is a list of the programmatic information we need to review. You're allowed to write on this checklist and send it back with your notes. For example, if you do not have licensed staff, you can write not applicable or NA on that line so that we know that you didn't forget to send it, it just doesn't apply to you, and that is acceptable. All right, how do I send my documents? It is extremely helpful for our staff if your agency can send each of these documents in a separate file labeled number 1, number 2, number 3, etc. If that means that multiple emails are necessary, that's fine. What's most important to us is that all the information is provided and that it's provided in a manner that's easily navigable for us. All documentation provided should be within the performance period stated on the top of the checklist and for the grants requested that are on top of the checklist. Now we're going to go in detail to review examples of each of the documents on the list. Number 1, the program organization chart. This is an example of an organization chart. When we review this, we're looking to see if the individuals reimbursed on the award are listed. We also look at it when reviewing your fiscal and internal control policies. Number 2, staff and job titles. Your program staff and job title list will obviously look different than this because this is ours. You'll list all staff associated with each funding source that we're reviewing. Number 3, program licenses. You must provide copies of all licensed employees that fall under the grants listed on your checklist. These licenses must be current and fall under the review period. Number 4, contracts. If you have any contracts in the contract section of your budget for any awards that we are monitoring, we do need copies of these contracts. If you don't have any contracts on your awards, this will not apply to your agency. If you do have contracts, copies of all contracts must be provided prior to initial reimbursement for your contractor. They must be for the grant period and have specific details regarding expectations, pay, contract start and end dates. Contracts need to be reviewed at the agency level at least once every 3 years. They should also have some language about confidentiality. Most of you have already submitted some of your contracts, and that's great. You don't have to resubmit them. Just let us know that you've submitted them. But we do have to have a copy of the contracts prior to RFR payment for your contractors.
So Jean, before we get
Yes.
too far, we had 2 questions in the chat. One, are you able to provide a Dropbox or other portal that makes it a bit easier to upload? And I let people know that, well, I forgot to let them know. If you wanted to create a Dropbox and invite us to that, that is fine. You can download the documents from that Dropbox. We're okay with that. And we are working on having our new grant management portal have a way for you to upload documents much easier, but that will not be in place for this year's monitoring. Jean, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope, that's a perfect answer.
Okay. The second question we got was, if I have a licensed staff member, but the staff member does not provide services under that license, do you still want the license?
No, so for example, I'm a licensed CNA, but I don't perform work as a CNA, so I don't have to provide my license for that because I'm not working in that capacity. If you have like a licensed marriage and family counselor, you're going to want to provide that license if they're providing counseling services. But if they're a licensed marriage and family counselor and they're just working in the capacity as an advocate, then they wouldn't need to provide that license because they're only doing advocacy work.
Great, thank
Do
you.
you want to add anything to that? Okay, perfect.
No, I think that was, and we have one more question. We are using a contract employee for match. With the change to the match reporting, do you still need the contract?
No. If your contract or licensed employees are just for match and your program is for VOCA, then no, you don't need to provide that contract as its match information. If that particular person is for FIPSA, then yes, you would need to provide that because FIPSA is still requiring match documentation.
And so we got a follow up to that that says, so number 4 is actually for our employees associated with each grant under the grants being monitored.
That is correct.
And sometimes contracts are not for just employees. Sometimes a contract will be with an agency that you're paying to do a service. So not all contracts, it's just anything listed in your budget section under contracts that you're billing on that award in the contract section. Would you agree with that, Jean?
Yes. So if you look at your NOSA in your budget section under your contracts, anything that's listed in that contract section, we would need a copy of that contract for.
And if you don't have any, you can put NA on that requirement and move to the next checklist item.
Perfect. All right, well, we'll keep paused here for just a second. Do we have any further questions about what we've talked about so far? You guys good for me to move forward?
I think they are. We'll come back to anything that gets asked.
Okay, awesome. So the next one is the confidentiality policy and procedure. Confidentiality policies must be provided for clients, staff, and volunteers that work with our grants. They must be informed, time limited, and signed. On this slide, there are 2 examples of confidentiality policies or what should be involved in them. Also attached to the meeting invite were examples of P&Ps, and I believe there are a couple confidentiality P&Ps in that packet. Number 6, program policies and procedures. Please send us the program policies and procedures that are funded under the grants we're reviewing. Policies, procedures, and employee handbooks should be reviewed and updated at least every 2 years. Number 7, drug-free workplace. Please share separately your drug-free workplace policy. This might already be included in number 6 of your policy and procedures, but if it is not, please make sure to send it. Number 8 is travel. Travel policies and procedures need to include the grant-specific regulations for travel found in GERS 22-17 and in the RFR training provided earlier this year. While the actual travel policies will be unique to each agency on how this process works, you do need to follow our travel regulations stated in the GERS as well. If none of your awards have travel or training in their budget, you can skip this item as not applicable. Number 9, board member list. Please submit a list of your current board members. Contact information is not necessary, but a list of members including active, inactive, and vacant does need to be provided. If you are a government agency, you can skip this as not applicable. Number 10, program board minutes. Please include the board minutes from the review period listed on your checklist. Again, this will not be applicable to government organizations. Number 11, your grievance policy and procedure. A copy of the client, staff, and volunteer grievance policies need to be included. These may look a little differently for each role, but should generally follow the same procedure. As we go through these, remember that we have provided some sample policies and procedures with this training to help you if you need to develop any of these, and we are available to provide technical assistance if you need to develop some of these items that are required. And some of or all of these might be part of number 6, your policies and procedures that you're submitting to us, but you want to triple check that they are in there or you're providing the separate P&Ps to us. Number 12 is non-discrimination. A copy of your agency's non-discrimination statement and policy must be provided.
So Jean, before we move on, we got a question.
Yes.
Can I cite the page of my P&P manual for number 5, 7, 8, and 11? And probably 12 now.
Yeah, that would be fine. While we would prefer to have them as separate numbers because it's a lot easier for us to make sure that that specific thing is in there. I understand that that can sometimes be a hardship on some of our smaller agencies. So if you can cite the page and document it so that we have an easy way to access it, that would be fine.
Great, thank you, Jean.
Okay, number 13, your disaster response. Disaster response plans should cover things that are unexpected events such as fire drills, terror attacks, blackouts, flooding, pandemics, active shooter, etc. Every staff member and volunteer should be aware of the disaster response plans and should have documented reminders in their files at least yearly. This slide has an example of what should be in a disaster recovery plan, and we did provide examples of what those look like in our packet. Number 14 is your limited English. Your limited English proficiency policy should include persons who do not speak English and persons who have difficulty hearing. This policy should not be exclusive of English and Spanish populations. We are a melting pot and you need to have ability to assist people who don't speak English or Spanish. Thank you. Number 15, whistleblower policies and procedures need to be included. We have examples of these in our packet, and there's also information on this slide of what those policies should kind of include. Number 16, your civil rights compliance checklist. We've already talked about this form, but please remember that it is required. If you have already sent it in, just mark that on your checklist, and I'll make sure that that gets into your file if it isn't already. If you're not sure if you've sent that in to us, please make sure that you include it in with your packet. Number 17, client intake forms. Please provide a copy of a blank client file. Everything that is given or done with a client should be provided to us. This includes, but is not limited to, intake forms, confidentiality, non-discrimination, assessment, safety plan, progress notes, demographic information, or any other client forms that are given to the client. We do not want any client forms that are already filled out. Just blank client information forms or whatever you give to the client should be provided to us to make sure that all of the demographic and information is entered in or at least asked for. All right, number 18, brochures. Any printed materials paid for by grant funding need to be included. These must include the statement found in section C on your NOSA. I've also included that statement onto this slide.
Jean, just a reminder, the statement on the slide is just for VOCA. So
yes.
You would want to make sure you're looking at what grant you used to pay for it and go to that section C and pull the statement from there. And then we did get a question that most of that goes into our, so they're talking about the forms, number 17, and most of it goes into their electronic medical record. So there's not a physical form. How do you want that handled?
If you can provide screenshots, or when we do our monitoring, if you can walk through a blank file, that would be fine. We do need to see a blank record of some sort. Okay, the next one is our MOUs. Please include any applicable memorandum of understandings with your documents. Please remember that these must be current and within the review period. Breach of PII. What is your agency's policy or response to an actual or imminent breach of personally identifiable information? We need to know that policy and procedure. 21 is your staff or volunteer background checks with PII redacted. Background checks for staff and volunteers designated to our grants need to be provided with personally identifiable information redacted.
So we got a question. We do not have background checks for our staff and volunteers. Do we need them now?
Yes, background checks are required for any program staff or volunteers that are working with VOCA specifically, but any of our grants, they do require background checks, as we do need to make sure that there are not people that have a history of domestic violence assisting domestic violence victims.
So we got a follow-up that said we do have criminal, never mind. And then we got one that said, my background checks are done and maintained by the sheriff.
Okay, if you have specific issues that are related to your agency that you're unsure of, I know there's a couple people that have already reached out to me. Go ahead and reach out to us and we will check to see what we need to do for your specific issue. But generally speaking, if you have program staff and volunteers, you do have to have a copy of their background check, and it does need to be made available to grant funders. So if we're having issues with that, or we're not sure how to send that or provide that information, follow up with us individually, and we can walk you through that.
I think that there's two more comments, and I think one of them might actually get to it, so I'm going to read it first. It says, do you need the actual background checks redone? Oops, sorry, things are moving. And then it said, in the past, in lieu of actual background checks, we provided certifications that they have been completed and passed. Will this be okay? And then
that would be fine.
Yeah, and then we have so maybe that will be what most of you might need to do instead of sending the actual one, just send some kind of certification of what background checks you do and how you do it and that they have been done on all employees. And then we had one that said, I'm concerned about this. The state is very strict about how these are shared. I'm only supposed to share them with the subject of the record. Do you mean the DCFS CAMS check? And so I think just certification of that you're doing them and which ones you're doing and how you're doing the background check should suffice for us. Would you agree, Jean?
Yes, that would be fine.
And then we got a question, do you need these background checks redone periodically, or is it the one and done?
At this point, we definitely need it one and done. We're looking into the background check information from the feds on what their policies are for us. And we will let you know if we do need to have further background checks done periodically throughout the employee's life.
Yeah, so we haven't requested this in the past always, and so we want to make sure that we are capturing this. So we'll do a little more research, and when we send out the PowerPoint presentation and FAQ, we'll have more information on this. Someone said that it used to be every 5 years, so we'll check and see what is the frequency and if a certification will just suffice that you're doing it and how you're doing it. Does that sound like a good plan, Jean?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, we got one more. We did get the DHHS background check as we do things for kids. Is that okay?
I think that should be fine. If you want to send that to us with the PII redacted, we can verify if that's okay. We basically just want to make sure that these are being done for all of your staff and volunteers to make sure that, like I said, people with a history of domestic violence or abuse are not assisting victims of domestic violence. So we just really want to make sure that these are being done. And I'm really okay with however you can get that information to us.
All right. I think we're going to move on from background checks. If you have more questions, if we have time at the end, we can come back to this one.
Okay. All right, so your equipment or inventory log. Per GERS 22-22, your equipment and inventory log needs to be provided and updated yearly with the use and condition of the equipment paid with grant funds. If you do not have any equipment budget on any of your awards, this will not be applicable to you. All right, we're going to pause real quick because I think I saw another question pop up, and then we're going to test your knowledge over what we just discussed.
Yeah, they were asking if providing billing information from the background check company would show that it's being done regularly. And I was going to respond in the chat that I feel like that would be sufficient. What are your thoughts, Steve?
Yeah, I think that'll be okay. We might have to do a little bit of investigating to make sure that that information is okay. So yeah, we might have to get back to you on that particular answer, but yeah, I think that would be fine.
Cool.
Okay. All right, so we're going to test your knowledge. How much did you learn from what we just talked about? How often is it recommended that policies and procedures be reviewed and updated? Once a year, every 2 years, every 5 years, as needed, or none of the above?
Oh, that was weird.
I know. Our questions are changing real quick. Or our answers, anyway. So it looks like everybody in the chat thinks it's B. And it looks like our polls keep changing a little bit. Most of you think it's every 2 years. A couple of you think it's once a year. And a handful of you think it's as needed. So it is every 2 years that it is recommended. Now, if things change, you're more than welcome to update them as needed or every year if you're really, gung-ho about updating your policies, but it is recommended that you at least look at and update your policies every 2 years. Current proof of licenses should be submitted for A, all mental health providers, B, all licensed legal staff, C, all licensed staff working on grant-funded awards, or D, therapists only, or E, none of the above. All right, it looks like we got a lot of really quick responses and everybody agrees that it should be C, all licensed staff working on a grant-funded award, and you guys are all correct. All right, confidentiality policies and verification need to be for executive staff only, all staff, volunteers, and clients, or D, depends on the agency and type of services being provided. All right, it looks like most everybody is in agreement that it's C. We have a couple people that think it should be all staff. The answer is C. All staff, volunteers, and clients must be notified and have documentation in their files of confidentiality policies. All right, our next question, the agency's grievance policy should cover A, staff, B, volunteers, C, contractors, D, clients, E, all of the above, or F, none of the above. That was a very quick answer. Looks like everybody is in agreement that it is E, all of the above, and you guys are correct. Grievance policies should be sent to everybody. Our next question is, agencies using electronic files do not need to send us a copy of a blank client file. True or false? Awesome. It looks like everybody has chosen false, and you guys are all correct. You will need to send us a copy of a blank client file by using either screenshots or screen share when we do the monitoring. Reach out to us if you have questions or need assistance with the client files. All right, do we have any questions lingering with programmatic documentation? I know we answered a bunch while we were going through. Do we have any that we want to address before we move on to the fiscal documentation?
I'm not seeing any in the chat right now.
Okie dokie. Well, we will go ahead and move on to our fiscal documentation. The same process that was done with our programmatic documents should be done with your fiscal documents. Separate files listed numerically following the review period listed and the grants being reviewed. So number 23, 24, 25, etc. If that means that multiple emails are necessary, that is fine. What's most important to us is that all the information is provided, and it's provided in a manner that is easily navigable. All documentation should be within the performance period stated on top of the checklist for the grants requested that are listed on the checklist. We're going to go into detail on all the documents required for fiscal. Okay, so the first thing is your insurance certificate. An important reminder is that the state of Nevada must be a certificate holder on your insurance accord. We only need the insurance accord and not your entire policy. The accord is a one-page document that will have a summary of the information we need to see, and on the bottom of that will have us listed as a certificate holder. You can see a copy of an accord with the sensitive information removed on this slide. I just removed the sensitive information because it is being shared with everybody. We don't really need the sensitive information removed for your agency because it's not really it's on your insurance accord. So your fiscal policy and procedures. So we do need to provide a copy of your agency's fiscal policies and procedures, including separation of duties, internal controls, and your procurement policy. Again, we will have some samples of these for you if you need help getting some in place. It is also important that your staff knows the policies and procedures and are following them. Your internal controls. Provide your internal control policy. Internal controls are the mechanisms, rules, and procedures implemented by your agency to ensure the integrity of financial and accounting information, promoting accountability and preventing fraud. An example of one of the things that should be included in this policy is the segregation of duties, work duties that are divided among different people to reduce the risk of error or inappropriate actions. Sometimes the internal controls are part of an agency's fiscal policies and procedures, but you need to check to make sure that they are either addressed in the fiscal P&Ps or they're submitted separately. Your general ledger. Please provide a copy of your general ledger. Yes, we will need the full agency and a separate ledger for the grants that we fund. On this slide, you'll see an example of a redacted chart of accounts and an example of what should be included on a chart of accounts. Okay, cost allocation plan. The cost allocation plan is going to identify activities and activity pools. It's going to directly trace or estimate costs to activities and cost objectives, assign costs to activity cost pools, calculate activity costs or rates, assign costs to cost objects, and prepare reports. So your cost allocation, we're going to go through this on a couple of slides, but we do need to know what your cost allocation plan looks like, and you're going to have an actual cost allocation plan. Here you can see the first page of a redacted cost allocation plan. Cost allocation plans should be both narrative and a table. The table will show the breakdown of costs allocated by funding sources. An example of this will be on the next slide, but I want to make sure that you guys have a moment to see this cost allocation plan here so that you can understand and see how it looks as a narrative. And then on the next slide, Julie. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I believe we also attached a template for one on the.
We did.
Yeah, so to the invite, and so if you need to create one, there is a template for you that is designed by DOJ, the Department of Justice.
Yes. And then on the next slide, this is an extremely simplified cost allocation table. Yours should have more detail allocated to your expenses and to your funding sources, depending on the rules and allocabilities of your various funding streams. This is just a simplified example of what a cost allocation table looks like so that you have a reference. We have a lot of questions and a lot of issues with cost allocation in the past. So we really wanted to make sure that you guys had examples and were able to see what the table looks like, what the policy could look like. But we definitely need to have this information so that we can see that all of your funds and your costs are being allocated separately to your funding sources.
We got a question, Jean. Yeah, is this when using percentages?
Yes and no. However your agency is going to allocate, generally it's easier for agencies to allocate via percentages to the different things. If you have a different way that you allocate, that's fine. You just need to be able to show how you allocate costs, and it needs to be allocated amongst all funding sources in a logical manner. Did you want to add anything to that, Julie?
So what we see is a lot of places charge 100% of almost a lot of their costs to, let's say, VOCA, and then they may be using another award to pay for 100% of some other costs, but we're just seeing 100%. So things that are used for multiple programs, like say your office rent, if you have an office and you're running several programs out of that, the 100% of the rent should not be allocated to VOCA. And then we got a question is, if all charges are direct, do you need this? And the answer to that is yes, we still need that if all charges are direct. Would that be correct, Jean?
Yes. Yeah, so just show us how that looks like. So for example, when you look at the cost allocation table on this slide, under personnel, you'll see that all the percentages are kind of whited out and it says cost allocated by time and effort. So because we have a requirement from all of our funding sources that you have to provide an activity-based or time and effort time card, all of your personnel costs are going to vary throughout the year from all of your funding sources. So that allocation is by your time and effort. And that's fine if that's how you're going to allocate that. But as far as all of your stagnant bills, like your rent, your utilities, your janitorial, anything that you do for usually multiple programs, those are going to be allocated out separately. So they're not necessarily indirect charges, but they're direct charges that use different funding sources to provide different programs.
And then we got a question, is the cost allocation table only for the program within the agency that receives VOCA funding? No, it would be for anybody receiving any of our awards. We would need to see how those costs that cross different programs are being divided by those funding streams. So yeah. The only people who would not, I guess, need to provide a cost allocation table would be those who only have one funding stream, but usually that's a disqualifier for receiving funding because you need to have proof that you have enough funding if that grant was to go away to sustain your program. So I wouldn't think that there would be anybody who wouldn't need some kind of cost allocation plan. All right, if you guys, I know this is a tricky one. If you guys have more questions about that, just keep putting them in the chat. And when we get to the end, if we have time, we'll address them. And if we don't, we'll issue a frequently asked questions document with the answers on them too.
Okay. Thank you, Julie. All right, so we're going to move on our accounts payable. Here's an example of a redacted accounts payable form. We do need to have your accounts payable, your matching funds. So because VOCA has waived the matching funds allocation table, we don't need that if your only funding source, or not, sorry, only reviewed award is VOCA. I did make this slide before we found out that match was being waived for VOCA, but as far as FIPSA is concerned, you do have to have a matching funds allocation table. And this should just be a real quick snapshot of all your match sources and how they're allocated to each funding source that requires match by month. This shows us that your match is documented, tracked, and unduplicated. So I did put a pretty detailed match table on this slide, so you guys kind of have an idea of what that looks like, or what that should look like for your awards. So you can discount the VOCA because this year VOCA has waived match, but if you do have FIPSA or FIPSA ARP, you're going to want to make sure that you do provide that match table. Yes.
FIPSA ARP does not have a match requirement.
Well, look at that. I'm totally losing my mind today.
Sorry, I didn't catch that when we made the slides. I apologize too. I reviewed these.
No worries. It's been a month. Okay. So our next one is the organization budget. Here's an example of an organization budget. The one you submit to us will most likely look a little different, but this is an example if you're unsure what an organization budget should look like. Your indirect cost pool. This is an example of what your indirect cost pool should look like. You can see how it's allocated to the funding source and allocated as an indirect expense. While you do not need to show us the invoices and payments for indirect costs, they do need to be allocated in your accounting system, and we do need to see what that indirect cost pool looks like for the period that we're reviewing. Number 33 is the indirect cost rate. This is an example of a redacted negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. If your agency has one of these, it does need to be shared with us. If your agency does not have one, just let us know that you don't. You're not required to have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, nor are you required to utilize indirect on your budget. However, if you do, you are responsible for documenting it. 34 is your single audit or financial opinion report. All agencies are required to have a yearly federal single audit if they receive over $750,000 in federal funding, total, not just from one federal grant. So if your agency receives $500,000 in VOCA funding and $300,000 in FIPSA funding, you will receive over $750,000 in federal funding and do need to have a single audit performed. If your agency receives less than $750,000 in federal funding, you should have a financial opinion done yearly. All right, our next slide is employer quarterly contribution and wage report. This is a redacted example of the employer quarterly contribution. We will also accept the accounting wage report if you have that available. We will need your bank statements for the period required. And then before we move on, I think we have a couple questions. Sorry.
No, just one that I've seen. It says, as a county, the audit is done online. May I cite the online location? Yes, definitely. I know the county and the state one is quite a large document. If you just provide the link to where we can obtain that, that is appropriate.
Yes, that's fine. I did get a question privately. If VOCA waived match for FY22, will we receive a new NOSA that reflects that change? So you're not going to get a new NOSA, but you are going to get a sub-award amendment. We are working on this documentation and what that policy looks like. Like I said, we just found out about last week that this match was waived for FY22. So we're working internally to get all of that information put together and make sure all of that is completed for all of our VOCA agencies. So we will hopefully get that out to you within the next couple weeks, if not hopefully at least by the end of October.
I don't know if it'll be that quick, Jean, because we have to get the policy revision approved by OVC. So
Gotcha.
Our goal is to get it out by the end of December. But we did want to let everybody know that the match is waived, so you do not have to keep documenting that. And if you need something in email or in writing of that from us, we can do that, but we will work on getting formal letters out and sub-award amendments completed. But we do need to have our policy approved by OVC, so that can be a time-consuming process, and we have no control over how long that takes. So it may be till the end of this year, December 31st, that we take to get that completed. We did get another question. If we have already put in match for VOCA, can we use that on another grant? Yes, you can. You just need to let us know, and we'll revise the RFR that you submitted to show that the match is moved, and then we can move that to another grant for you if it's with us, or we can let you know so you can report it to another grant if you have other grants outside of us that need match.
Yeah.
We got one that says, you mentioned the other day that if volunteer time was matched, and since it was waived, we do not take the waiver, we can't use the service information from volunteers on our programmatic reports. Is that correct? And yes. And so that's why some people might decide to decline the match waiver and continue to report match. And so those volunteers are overseen by paid staff on the grant. So this is really confusing to me. This is just the guidance we got from OVC. And they specifically cited that if match was volunteers or interns, unpaid interns, or paid interns even that were from a different funding source, that couldn't be counted on PMT. So that was the guidance we got from OVC at this time, Danielle. We will continue to provide more information to people as we get it, but it's really new. Does that make sense, Jean?
Yes.
Do you have anything to add on that?
I do not. I think what you replied was correct and awesome.
We got another one that says, is there a benefit to continuing to show match if not required, if we are able to document it? The benefit would be if you wanted to count those services provided, but other than that, I can't think of a real benefit of documenting match. Can you, Jean?
No, it would just be if you want to add those services to your quarterly reports. But as far as grant funding is concerned, there is no benefit to continuing to show match. For VOCA, we can't make funding decisions based on whether or not you provided match.
Yeah, so if your match is like space rental or something that's not directly accounted for in your PMT and wouldn't affect that report, I wouldn't see a reason why you would want to report match. Would you, Jean?
No.
I don't know if it will help the state in the future to show that other agencies were providing that match in terms of other funding to continue to report that, but the feds have decided that we will waive it for everyone, so it'll be completely up to you guys if you want to continue to report match or not.
Yeah, and this is just a temporary waiver, so because of the pandemic, so it's not that match is going away from VOCA completely, it's just because of the pandemic, the VOCA fix has allowed us to waive the match for subrecipients for this fiscal year. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and ask a couple questions.
Did we go over 36?
We did. We need your bank statement.
Okay.
Okay, which of these is an example of an internal control policy? A, your grievance policy, B, your confidentiality policy, C, your travel policy, or D, segregation of duties policy. Okay, it looks like everybody in the chat has answered D, and most everybody on the poll has answered D. There's a little handful of people who answered C, the travel policy. And those of you who said D, the segregation of duties policy, is an example of the internal control policy. The next question is, if VOCA is your largest funder, you should allocate 100% of all expenses to VOCA until it runs out and then bill other funding sources. True or false? Awesome. Everyone was pretty quick on that answer. So yes, you are correct. It is false. You should have a cost allocation plan that details how your expenses will be separated out and divided across funding sources. Agencies using the 10% de minimis rate for indirect do not need to have documentation on what the indirect funds were used for. True or false? All right, it looks like we have a little bit of a disagreement. I love when people are agreeing on the answers. It's fun. Okay, so most everybody in the chat said false, and most everybody in the poll said false, and there's a handful of you guys who think that is true, that you do not need to have documentation on what the funds are used for. That is false. So the indirect costs do need to be separated out in your accounting system and tracked by funding sources. So while you don't need to provide information and backup documentation on your monthly RFRs, those indirect costs do need to be allocated in your accounting system. All right, do we have any questions on the policies and the procedures for programmatic and fiscal that we need to have provided to us?
I'm not
Doing
seeing
okay
any
so far?
questions. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're going to talk about the monitoring form and the monitoring. This next slide is a copy of the first page of our monitoring form. A copy of the entire form will be sent to each subrecipient that we're doing a virtual on-site review with prior to our visit. We're working on updating our form from last year, so if you have the form from last year, it's going to look a little bit different this year. So monitoring expectations, what to expect when we monitor. While 3 hours are reserved for your monitoring, we don't anticipate them lasting that long. A lot of the time is dependent upon if all documentation was sent on time from your agency, if the appropriate staff is available, and how many questions or follow-up is necessary from us. We tend to reserve a little bit of extra time to provide technical assistance or answer any questions you may have. We expect that all of your documents are sent to us by the deadline provided in your monitoring email so that we can review them prior to our visit. During this visit, at least one programmatic and one fiscal person should be available from your agency to answer our questions. We will talk about what was sent, ask about any missing documents, briefly discuss your scope of work, and then we'll ask a handful of questions that are listed on the monitoring form. Once we're done with our questions, we'll have an exit discussion where we will go over any recommendations or findings that we discovered during the monitoring. Following the exit discussion, we will assist with any technical assistance or any questions that you may have that you would like answered. Within 30 days of our monitoring, you'll receive an email from our staff with either a monitoring closure or a findings letter. From that point, you'll have 30 days to rectify findings. Common subrecipient challenges. This list of challenges is taken directly from the OVC website as concerns they have that impact our subrecipients directly. Those of you who have been funded by our agency for a few years will recognize a few of these bullet points as things that we have actively been working on to improve with everyone that we fund. For example, this year we went over the scope of work very clearly to make sure that the goals and objectives were measurable. Okay. Always remember, if you have questions, to reference your GERS or contact us so that you're aware of grant guides and expectations. GERS 22-25 through 29 talks about the monitoring, your risk assessments, quarterly reports, procedures for fiscal monitoring and administrative review of external audits, procedures for program site visits and monitoring, and any corrective actions that we may have with your agency. Do we have any questions on the monitoring process or anything that we've gone over today? I know it's a lot of information and that monitorings can be a little bit intimidating. So we wanted to make sure to provide this information so you kind of knew what to expect and what our expectations were. So if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them now.
We're going to go over a few more poll questions so you'll have time to put some additional questions you have. I know that we had some questions on that background checks and the cost allocation plans and on match. So if you have any questions about any of those topics, we can still have a little more time to go over those, or any new questions that you might have thought of as we went through this. So while we wait for those to come in, Jean, why don't we go through the next few slides and review with them a few more poll questions and the resources we provided.
Okay, perfect. So go ahead and ask your questions in the chat box if you have them. We would just like to know, how would you rate today's training? The red frowny face is absolutely terrible training, and the green happy face is like the amazing training. And remember that the poll is anonymous, and I won't be offended at all if everybody thinks it's a big frowny face. Okay, it looks like most everybody is replying with a happy face or a green happy face. That is awesome. I'm glad that you guys are finding this useful.
So Jean, we got a question in the chat that says, I see that you are recording this. Can I get a copy of it for review?
So I can't usually attach the file for the recording to emails because it's too big of a file, but it will be available on our website within the next week or two. I will also send out a summary of this training with the facts and all the attachments on it again. And if you have further follow-up questions, you're always welcome to contact us and we can help you through any of those.
And then someone said, Jean, I hate to ask this question, but as you know, or as I know you covered it, but if we have under $750,000 in grants, how often do we need financial review?
You are going to need to have that yearly. I know that question.
So do it biannually for both, like for 2 years at a time. Are we accepting that?
I think we used to be accepting that. I believe our policy changed this year that we wanted to have them yearly. I can double check on that with Erica, but the last time I talked with her, that was what she wanted. Okay.
So we'll review that and put it in the FAQ document that we'll release and check to see what the requirements are on that. Sound good?
Yeah.
I added it to our list.
Perfect. All right. So here's some contact information for us. RFR submittals, you know, as always, to funds requests. Any general questions should go to the DCFS grants box. And you can always use our personal emails to ask any questions that you may have as well. And then we have a lot of resources that we've added to this training. So the next slide is the DCFS resources, so our website where you can find our training videos, the grants training videos. So if you have new staff or would like to access this training once it becomes available, like I said, I will post out an email when it is available, and I will share all the information that we discussed today via email as well. But all of this is really good, helpful information for staff and agencies. Your civil rights and 211 links, remember these are required for all of our grants. Some sample policies and procedures, we've added some website links to these. We've also included them, not necessarily these ones, but we've included information for a lot of policies in with the meeting invite, the training invite, financial management resources. These are good resources for you to look at for just kind of some information on how to do financial management. Some budget planning resources, bookkeeping and accounting resources, and then indirect cost resources. So this is where you get the new OMB guidance on indirect costs, what it does and why it matters. And then internal control and accounting resources. These are all really just helpful resources for your agency. If you would like to use them, you don't have to use them, but they are helpful for your agencies. So I don't see any further questions pop up in the chat box. I want to thank you all for your time. If you have any further questions, feel free to ask them. But that is all that we have for you today.